Artística. Vou apresentar rapidamente a Isabela Noronha. Ela é jornalista e mestre em escrita criativa pela Universidade de Brunel, na Inglaterra. E ela é autora do livro infantil Adeus é para Super-Heróis, vencedor do prêmio Barco a Vapor. E é autora também de Resta 1, vencedor do prêmio da agência literária Curtis Brown e finalista do prêmio São Paulo. E de Carla B, seu último livro, bem recente, ambos pela Companhia das Letras. A Isabela vai apresentar a conversa, vai moderar o papo com a Bernardine. Bernardine Evaristo é uma premiada escritora anglo-nigeriana, nascida em Londres. Ela é autora de obras de ficção, ficção em versos, ensaios, poemas, teatro e crítica literária. E ela é professora de escrita criativa na Universidade de Brunel, onde ela conheceu a Isabela, elas vão falar um pouco sobre isso. E ela é autora de, entre outros títulos, Garoto, Mulher, Outras, vencedor do Booker Prize em 2019, Manifesto e Senhor Loverman, todos pela Companhia das Letras. A Bernardine Evaristo veio ao Brasil a convite da FLUP. Ela vai participar de uma conversa com a Conceição Evaristo depois de amanhã, no Rio, no Circo Voador, por ali. Eu vou. Muito feliz. Esse evento ele tem o apoio do Instituto Tomie Ohtake. Vamos dizer também que o evento está sendo filmado. No final, o público pode fazer perguntas, é só levantar a mão que a gente leva o microfone. E no final, a Bernardine Evaristo vai assinar os livros aqui em cima, na livraria. Então, fiquem à vontade para trazer os livros dela, ela vai ficar muito contente. E vai ter uma cervejinha oferecida pela Megafauna. Aqui a gente agradece mais uma vez pelo apoio e pela parceria de sempre. É isso. Com vocês, Isabela Noronha, Bernardine Evaristo.
Boa noite, gente.
Boa noite.
Vou começar agradecendo a presença de todo mundo aqui. Estou muito feliz de estar aqui, muito emocionada, muito nervosa também. Quero agradecer também a Companhia das Letras, a Alice, o Max, pelo convite para estar nessa conversa com a Bernardine. A gente se conhece já há algum tempo. A Bernardine foi minha professora há 13 anos, né, de escrita criativa na Universidade de Brunel, em Londres. E ela me ajudou na construção, me ajudou muito na construção do meu primeiro romance, que é o Resta 1, que foi publicado pela companhia. E ela ainda é a voz que eu escuto enquanto eu estou escrevendo. E ouvindo a Bernardine, acho que nas nossas trocas, né, acho que desde 2013 a gente se encontrou algumas vezes. A voz dela, naquilo que ela fala sobre literatura, foi sempre um norte, uma espécie assim de uma decodificação de uma literatura possível, uma literatura aberta, uma literatura muito corajosa, uma literatura única que teve que buscar o próprio espaço e encontrou o próprio espaço. E a minha primeira pergunta, então, tem a ver com isso, tem a ver com tem a ver com esse lugar, né, que a sua literatura encontrou. Você tem 10 livros publicados, os livros da Bernardine já chegaram a mais de 40 países, e ela já recebeu dezenas de prêmios, de indicações, de honrarias. Entre os prêmios que a Bernardine recebeu está o Booker Prize, que é um dos prêmios mais prestigiosos do mundo, pelo livro Garota, Mulher, Outras, né, que é um livro de 2019. E a Bernardine é uma mulher negra, uma mulher anglo-nigeriana. Ela não vem de uma família com recursos financeiros. E faz uma escrita, ela tem uma ficção, uma literatura que se propõe sempre a desafiar as convenções. Então, eu queria te perguntar, Bernie, como é que é para quem vem, para alguém que vem desses lugares que são tão pouco representados ou tão mal representados pelo mainstream, de repente perceber a própria literatura chegando a tantos lugares e, eu acho que, por muitos parâmetros, se tornando mainstream.
Okay, hi everybody, great to be here. Thank you very much for coming to see me, and huge thanks to Isabela for hosting this event and to my publisher for bringing me over. It's my first time in Sao Paulo. I arrived yesterday morning. I've had a great time so far. I'm leaving tomorrow morning, so it's a flying visit. Yeah, it's been very, very welcoming to be here. Lovely. And I love all the colors on the streets, the murals. I've never been anywhere that has this sort of scale of art on the streets everywhere you look. All beside the point. Yeah, you know, it's very interesting. Girl, Woman, Other completely changed my career, because when I won the Booker Prize, I overnight became an overnight success. But I had actually been writing professionally for 40 years before then. So I had this very, very long career. And then suddenly, my name was out there in the world. As Isabela said, there were all these translations of my books. I've been traveling the world for the last few years, doing appearances at festivals and all kinds of events. And I know how this book has reached people, not only women, but especially women all over the world, whether they're black or white or Asian or whatever. You know, this is a book where I accept, because people have told me that it reaches them in certain ways. So this has been incredibly satisfying and gratifying for me, because for a very long time I wanted to reach a really large audience with my work. Girl, Woman, Other took between 5 and 6 years to write. That's a long time. And to spend a long time writing a book and then to reach a few thousand people can be very disheartening. And I wanted my work to have the kind of impact that I felt it deserved. And that happened 5 years ago, 2019, when I won the Booker. So it's been a really great experience. And I've, you know, coming here talking about the book has also been really interesting to hear people talk about what it means to them, and also my novel, Mr. Loverman, which is published here, and my memoir, Manifesto, subsequent books will be published here. So it's a really exciting time.
That's great. Thank you. E eu quero falar um pouquinho, então, sobre Sr. Loverman. Sr. Loverman acabou de ser lançado aqui no Brasil pela Companhia das Letras também, mas já é um livro que você lançou há mais tempo, né? Então, o personagem principal, o Sr. Barrington, ele é muito carismático, ele é muito engraçado, mas, ao mesmo tempo, ele diz coisas, né? Ele às vezes é um pouco homofóbico, às vezes ele é um pouco sexista. Então, eu queria te perguntar por que você fez essa escolha para esse personagem e como que você pensa nesse tipo de representação, sendo que a gente está tratando de temas que são tão sensíveis, são temas urgentes, são temas sensíveis, mas como que você pensa, como que você traz isso para a sua literatura, assim, sem ficar de um jeito muito pronto, repetindo um discurso de uma maneira que soa muito original, né?
So Mr. Loverman, for those who don't know, is a novel about a black man from the Caribbean. He's 74 years old. He's homosexual, but he's in the closet. He's been married to his wife, Carmel, for 50 years, and he's been lovers with his best friend, Morris, for 60 years. So it is a queer story about an elderly Caribbean man, which I'm not Caribbean, I'm not a man, I'm not queer, but I was in my 20s. It's also about his children and his grandchild. And it's set in London, in a part of London called Hackney, which was one of the areas traditionally settled by Caribbean people in the 50s and 60s. He's been in the UK for 50 years. He is also homophobic. Yes. So he's internalized homophobia. And as he says to Morris, his lover, I'm not a homosexual, his name is Barry. He says, I'm not a homosexual, I'm a barrysexual, right? So he's kind of in denial about his sexuality. And that makes him a really interesting character. His wife, Carmel, does not know he's gay. She's been married to him for 50 years in a very toxic marriage, as you can imagine. She thinks he plays around with other women. But in actual fact, the great family friend, Uncle Morris, as they call him, is his lover. And for me, this was really exciting territory, because when I started writing this book, it was published in 2013. I started writing it in 2009, and there was quite a lot of coverage in the media about homophobic legislation in the Caribbean and in Africa. And in the UK, we have what was called the Windrush generation. And that was the generation of people who came from the Caribbean in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. They settled in the UK, and they were the first big wave of Caribbean people to settle in the UK. And the portrayal of them has always been heterosexual, right? Nobody would think that these people were homosexual. And so at the same time, there was all this news about homophobia in the Caribbean, and I just thought it was really fertile territory to explore, to create this character who is of that generation, but who is homosexual. He comes from Antigua, which is one of the Caribbean islands, and just to say, Antigua just repealed its homophobic, anti-homosexual laws 2 years ago, right? And it's still illegal in some of the other Caribbean countries. But these homophobic laws were what the British brought to the Caribbean. In Britain, we essentially got rid of homosexual laws in 1967. So it's taken much longer for them to go from the Caribbean. So you have this person growing up, knows he's queer from the age of 14, which is when he becomes lovers with Morris, and comes to Britain, and he has to survive in what was then a very racist society, a very openly racist society, which it was in the 50s and 60s, and he's homosexual. Of course he's going to bury his sexuality. So it is just very interesting territory for me. And also it requires me to imagine the perspective of people from lives that, the perspective of lives of people who are living lives very different to my own. Obviously, he's very different to me in every way possible. And that's what I love about writing fiction. I love characters, I love inhabiting my characters and bringing them to life from within and making them as convincing as possible for the reader.
Você tem uma formação no teatro também, que eu estou te ouvindo falar sobre essa construção do personagem e fiquei curiosa para saber como que o que você aprendeu no teatro, ou o seu envolvimento com o teatro, te ajuda na construção desses personagens.
Yeah, so my first career was as an actress in theatre, and I formed a theatre company when I left drama school called Theatre of Black Women, and we were the first such company in Europe, and we formed this company because nobody was interested in employing black women in theatre. There was no really sort of parts for black women in theatre, so we formed this company, and I also became a writer because in order to put on plays, we had to write them. And so my first venture into theatre as a professional person was writing monologues that I also performed. And that means that I was writing for performance and then performing, which means communicating to an audience in a very direct way, in the way that I'm communicating to you today. And I realized that the way in which I create character in my fiction comes from that. Because as an actor, you have to be the person. Try to be the person that you're playing. And as a writer, with my protagonists, I try to be them when I'm writing them, to write them from the inside. So when I was writing Barrington, he speaks with I don't know how that has been translated into Portuguese, but he speaks with a light Caribbean inflection in the British version. And when I was writing him, I was speaking as he was. So for example, my husband would come home and I would speak to him as Barrington. I would say, "Oh, hello, darling, how you doing?" And he would laugh because I was like, oh, no, that's Barrington. Because I would spend all day at home being the 74-year-old Caribbean man, right? And it's kind of slightly schizoid, and it's very strange behavior, but it is such a pleasure to be other people. I find it so rewarding and enriching and exciting, and I find it's an adventure because even though I have quite a healthy ego, I'm not a complete narcissist, right? So I'm not that fascinated by myself, but I'm fascinated by all of you sitting here, right? I'm more interested in hearing who you are and what your story is and what the story is behind the story. So it's a very exciting experience writing, especially when it feels like the character magic is happening and the character is coming alive and kind of like telling their own story. They're telling me the story that they want me to tell them.
Bom, falando nos personagens, né, ganhando vida, o Mr. Loverman, o Sr. Loverman, Barrington, ele foi transformado numa série pela BBC, né? Eu queria que você contasse um pouquinho de como foi essa transposição do livro para a série, o quanto do seu próprio texto a série preservou, se isso era importante para você, que tivesse ali, por exemplo, as falas dos personagens fossem muito fiéis ao que está no livro, e qual o seu envolvimento?
So it was what we called optioned. So a production company kind of bought the initial rights 6 years ago, and they eventually found a writer to adapt it. And I said to him to use the dialogue as much as possible in the novel, because the dialogue is very performative, and it's kind of what makes the characters. And also to stay as truthful to the novel as possible, because I could see that the novel would work as a drama in terms of the structure. You know, we know what the desires are, we know what the obstacles are, we know what the resolution is. And so that's what he did. You know, he stayed very truthful to the novel. Of course, because it is screen drama, he had to move things around a bit. But he didn't, for example, introduce new characters. He didn't take the characters right away from what they are in the book. So it's a very truthful version. And then they cast it. And a couple of the actors are pretty famous actors. And so then the next thing was to see how they were going to perform my characters, because the characters lived in my head for a number of years, and then they're going to be materialized on the screen. And I didn't know how that was going to be. I was very happy with what they've done, because I would say that the characters are very true to the story, but slightly different. And that's fine, because an actor has to put his interpretation of the part onto the character. You know, when you're writing novels, as anybody in here who's a novelist will know, you are in control of everything. You know, you create the set, you create the dialogue, you create the structure, you create the characters. They do exactly what you want them to do. But when you hand it over to another medium, such as a television series, a lot of other people are involved in that. You know, you've got the director of photography who's going to find a certain way of telling the story through how it presents visually. You've got the set design, the costume design. You've got the actors. You've got the director. And they just sewed it together beautifully. It's a really powerful telling of the story. And one of the things I said to the producers, I said, because the characters, Barry and Morris, the two older men, they do have sex in the book, but it's done quite imagistically. And I said to them, you've got to have sex, right? I don't want people to think this is a story about two cozy little old men who don't do it, right? Because they do it. So when I went to a screening and they were doing it, I was like, oh my God, they really are doing it. And then I was like, hang on, you told them to. You said to them, make sure they do it, and they do. And that's really interesting, because what appears on the page, you have to visualize it, right? And when it's visualized for you, it is so impactful, because what they've done with the drama is there are a lot of close-ups on their faces. The actors go from very young, so there is a young cast who play the actors when they're very young, and then there are the actors playing the main characters at the age of 50, and then they're also in their 70s. So they're going through the eras, and there are a lot of close-ups in the drama, and you really are inside the characters. You know, you feel them, you can see the texture of their skin. And it really made me realize what a powerful medium screen is, because it's just there. It's so visceral and vivid and vital and exciting and believable, because you don't have to work so hard because you're watching. It's all there for you. When you read a book, you have to work harder. So it's been a really, really interesting experience, and it's gone down really well in the UK. It's been a hit, because that's then the next thing, is you worry that people are not going to like it. First of all, the critics aren't going to like it, and then the audience aren't going to like it, and people have loved it. And people have said to me, you know, my upper-class white grandmother in her 90s, in her old people's home, they all watch it every week, and they love it, right? And I realize it's a book and a drama that has different points of entry. So like there are young characters in it, and so young people can relate to the younger characters. There are the middle-aged daughters of Barry and Carmel, so people can relate to them. And then there are the older characters. And then there are sort of other relationships and friendships. So it's a very rich, fertile kind of creative project for people to find access points, even though they may not be from that community, they may not be queer, and so on.
That's muito interessante, assim. E te ouvindo falar, eu fiquei imaginando se para você é uma preocupação, se é uma coisa que ocupa a sua cabeça quando você está escrevendo, que o livro possa se transformar numa outra coisa, uma peça de teatro, um filme ou uma série, por exemplo. Eu não sei se você escreve, se essa chega a ser uma preocupação quando você escreve, porque eu acho que você é muito ambiciosa, né? E eu acho isso muito admirável, assim.
Well, you know, I think a lot of writers write so that their work can be adapted.
Yes.
And I read a lot of novels, and I can see some of the younger writers. I think you are writing this so it becomes a Netflix drama, or you are writing it so it becomes a film. There is something formulaic sometimes about the work that feels as if the writer that's what they want. In my case, I find it very exciting, the idea that it can be adapted, but I also know that I have to accept that they're going to do what they're going to do, and you only have a certain amount of control over that. But I would say most writers I know today are absolutely delighted when their work is, as we call it, optioned to be developed as a theatre piece or a dramatic piece. So at the moment, another book, Girl, Woman, Other, and Mr. Loverman, are also in development for theatre and television. So the television's now come out, so there's 3 other projects in development. And, you know, you have to go with the right producers, choose the right cast, the right director, and just hope and pray that they're going to do the work justice.
Bom, eu quero falar um pouquinho do Manifesto. O Manifesto é seu primeiro livro de não ficção. E eu queria te perguntar por que você decidiu escrever um livro sobre a sua vida.
So it felt like if I'd have written another novel after Girl, Woman, Other, I would have come under a lot of pressure. You can't compare a novel to a non-fiction book. So I kind of dodged the bullet of that sort of pressure. Is it going to be as good as the previous book? So that was part of the reason. Also, I've been touring as a writer pretty much all my life, so I've been talking about myself a lot. But I'd never written it down as a book. And when I won the Booker, a lot of people were interested in me. I gave many, many hundreds of interviews around the world, and you're not really in control of what they write, especially if it's in a foreign language. But sometimes when it's in the English language, you see what they write, and you think this is fiction, because it's not what I said. And that happens all the time. So I just thought it would be a great opportunity for people to get to know me in my own words. And also because I had broken through at a great age, at the age of 60, I also wanted them to know what it took to reach this point. So the book is about my life, but it's also about the sort of looking at my life through the prism of my creativity. So it's not just, this is my life, I was born here, and this was my childhood. It's about different aspects of my life that have shaped and been shaped by my creativity. So I look at my ancestry, I look at my my relationships, love relationships. I look at my the places I've lived in, my home situations, and so on.
E no manifesto você conta inúmeras histórias, né? E algumas delas são episódios de racismo. E eu queria saber como essas experiências, porque o livro também tem um subtítulo que é muito importante, né, que é sobre nunca desistir. Como esses episódios eles moldaram assim as escolhas que você faz como artista, como escritora?
So yeah, it's called On Never Giving Up, which felt like it was an appropriate title. Growing up in London in the 60s and 70s, before there was a Race Relations Act, which came into being in sort of mid to late 1970s, before there was a Sex Discrimination Act. So it was legal to be a racist, it was legal to be sexist, right? There weren't that many black people in London, and racism was very hard. You know, they used to smash the windows of our house because we were the black family in the street. My father had come from Nigeria in the 1940s, 1949, and my mother was a white English woman, so we were a mixed race family. And we stood out in this white area. I was the only black girl at my school for most of my time there. You know, all of that is character forming, and it all shaped me. And so on the one hand, I as an individual integrated into, you know, I always had friends. I went to the youth theatre from the age of 12, and I had a great social circle there. But on the other hand, you were always reminded that you were an outsider. Even though I was born in Britain, my culture was British because my father didn't pass on his Nigerian culture, not his language, nothing of his Nigerian culture. So I was born there, my culture was British, I felt like a British kid, I spoke like a British kid, but because my features and skin and so on were not typical white British, I was treated as somebody who was different. So you are on the one hand an insider, but you're also an outsider. And that's, with hindsight, that's a really interesting place to be when you're a creative artist, right? Because there's always a part of you that's looking in on the society that you live in. But it was difficult at times, you know, and my father was at the front line of racism because he was a very dark-skinned Nigerian man. As a girl who was lighter skinned, I was able to navigate it much easier, for example, than my brothers, because my brothers were also more on the front line of racism. But, you know, feminism saved me, in a way, because by the time I was in my late teens, I identified as feminist and read all the feminist books out there, especially the African-American women writers in this bookshop downstairs, Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, Bell Hooks, and they were at least one generation older than me. They were from a very different community of African Americans, much, much larger. We're a tiny percentage in the UK, but the African American community is powerful. They have been in America for like hundreds of years. They've had a strong black intelligentsia, middle class for hundreds of years. And these were the powerful women writers who were speaking to certainly me and my generation from across the Atlantic and inspiring me to become a writer, to be powerful, to speak out. And so then I was able to contextualize my own childhood through a black feminist prism, which, of course, when you're living through it, you don't have the words for it. My parents were very political in terms of race. They were activists. They were anti-racist activists. And, you know, my father worked in a factory and he was a shop steward. My mother was a school teacher. She was a trade unionist. So I came from a political family, but it wasn't a feminist family. My father was a patriarch, you know, definitely Nigerian old school patriarch. And so, you know, I was rebelling against that as well, from a father who was I experienced as so oppressive and domineering. So I kind of went through the sort of the negative aspect of being black and female as a child, and then I used it as ammunition and as my raison d'etre as a creative person ever since.
Okay, that's great. Você estava falando da sua família e eu fiquei curiosa para saber. Você tem 7 irmãos, né? 7 irmãos e irmãs. Tem mais alguém na família que trabalha com criatividade, com arte? Ou foi só você, a filha do meio?
So I have a sister who's a visual artist, and the others aren't in the arts at all.
Oh, ok. Bom, quero ainda voltar para o manifesto. Nesse livro você fala que a sua missão como escritora é explorar a diáspora africana passada, presente, real e imaginada. E os seus livros também trazem sempre questões de diversidade de gênero e de inclusão social. Mas o seu ativismo vai além do texto, né? Você tem muitas iniciativas afirmativas. E, por exemplo, você criou o Prêmio de Poesia Africana da Brunel, que é a universidade onde eu estudei, e que, salvo engano, é o prêmio de poesia africana mais bem pago do mundo. Não sei, acho que isso está no livro, no manifesto. E queria te perguntar, então, é papel do escritor atuar politicamente no mundo? E se você acha que qual que é a relação entre literatura e mudança social para você?
2 big questions.
Yes, we have time.
Yeah. You know, I believe in individual freedom,
Yes.
and so each writer makes up their own mind what their role is in the world. You know, my activism, I see my activism as kind of separate from my creativity. So even using those terms, diversity and inclusion, that's not what I'm thinking when I'm writing stories. I'm just thinking up stories that fill in the silences in our society, stories that haven't been written before or haven't been written in the way that I have written them. So, for example, we talked about Mr. Loverman. It's like there's very few black gay fiction, and when I wrote Mr. Loverman, I couldn't think of a single black gay novel in Britain, let alone one with an older men, you know? So I'm writing into those silences. The activist side of myself is somebody who sets up projects, and I've been doing that for many years, including Theatre of Black Women in the 80s. I've set up mentoring schemes and the Brunel Prize that you mentioned. I've recently set up something called the Royal Society of Literature's Scriptorium Award, which is a writing residency. And that is because I feel a sense of community and a commitment to my community. So, and I've felt that for decades. Winning the Booker has only given me a bigger platform to do this and get more attention for the schemes that I devise. It hasn't changed that aspect of myself. And I think that comes from my parents, because they were political activists. So, you know, my father had arrived in Britain in the 1940s. 20 years later, he is very active in the Labour Party. He's a local Labour councillor. He's helping the mainly white working class people in his area. That's what I grew up with. I also grew up with the Catholic Church for its sins. And you know, my mother was a real Catholic. She was a true Catholic. She was a very good person. And I grew up with that. So when I became politicized in terms of black feminism, I've always been thinking about how I can affect society at large through activist projects, not just through my own creativity. And that's just something I've continued to do. And I know there are other writers who also set up schemes, which is wonderful, and there are many writers who don't. And I think people should make their own mind up about where they see, how they see their creativity manifesting in society. Obviously, a lot of writers have very public platforms, and so they make themselves heard when there are global issues that are, you know, sort of exemplifying gross injustices. And they will use their platforms, and we know some of those names, right? And that's really important too. But I feel that we should respect each individual's right to explore their creativity, to be an artist in whatever way suits them. I'm not somebody who's a dictator, who thinks you should insist every writer should speak up and speak out on certain issues. But hopefully enough of them will do that. And then what was the second question?
Se você acredita... não, qual a sua opinião? Se tem alguma relação direta entre literatura e mudança social? Porque você estava dizendo que seus livros, que você busca essa mudança pelo seu ativismo, não só pela sua criatividade, pelo seu trabalho criativo, mas também pelo seu ativismo. Mas, então, também pelo trabalho criativo, assim, você acha que um livro é capaz de provocar mudanças? Ou que tipo de mudanças?
So I think, we have to be careful with the terminology there, because I think most writers aren't writing fiction for social change. Yes. And I think it then becomes maybe didactic, maybe prescriptive, maybe educational. And I feel that as creatives, we have to explore characters and stories in whatever way we want to explore them without kind of having a predicted outcome, because I think that will then shape what you're writing. And so, for example, back to Mr. Loverman, I did not write this book to educate people about homosexuality, or I didn't write it for social change. But if that is a kind of a consequence for some people, then that's a great thing, right? Because what literature does is it opens our eyes to lives and cultures and societies and eras that are not the ones that we personally experience, as well as the ones that we personally experience. So anybody who reads widely and reads globally is going to be informed about the rest of the world through the literature that they read, right? And that's the wonderful thing. So like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, I know she's very popular here, so anybody reading Chimamanda's book will have a deeper understanding of what it's like to be in Nigeria, not a definitive experience of Nigerians. There is no such thing as a definitive experience, but they will have more insight into what it's like to be a young person from Nigeria living in America, or what the Civil War was like in Nigeria in the Biafran War in the 1960s. So it opens your eyes, right? Because through characters, through going on the journey of the characters in fiction, we expand who we are and our understanding of other people. And through that, there may be social change, right? So I feel that we have to be very careful not to be prescriptive and not to predict either. And also, you cannot predict how readers are going to feel about your work, because each reader who comes to your work will have an individual life, an individual set of perspectives and background and culture and the rest of it. So you don't know, you just don't know how they're going to respond. And I feel it's quite creatively dangerous to think that you do know how they can respond. So when people around the world say to me, that Girl, Woman, Other had a great effect on them, I'm always surprised, because I'm not writing about their lives, but they're somehow connecting to the humanity of those characters and finding, points of connection with their experiences that resonate with them. I could never have predicted that.
That's amazing. Qual foi, assim, o personagem que te veio com mais facilidade? E qual de todos os personagens, e aqui eu estou falando de todos os livros, foi o mais difícil para você?
All the books?
Yes.
Okay, let's just stick with Mr. Loverman and Girl, Woman, Other, because that's very recent, relatively. Barrington and Mr. Loverman was really easy. He just came. He just jumped in and started talking to me. And I wrote the book quite quickly for me, which is a couple of years. In Girl, Woman, Other, Amma came very easily, because she's the only character who is slightly autobiographical, because her early life slightly resembles my early life. And also her daughter came very easily, because I found her very entertaining, and I know young women who are 19, 20, 21, and so I just drew on them to write her as a character. And then there are characters who are they are so hard to work with that often they don't make it into a book. So before I wrote Mr. Loverman, I spent a few years on another book about a Gambian seaman who settles in Cornwall in the 19th century and ends up working down a tin mine. And after about 2.5, 3 years, I couldn't bring him to life. I spent way too long on him, and I threw him in the bin. Oh. Yeah. He became a short story of a few thousand words, but I threw about 40,000 words away.
Esse conto foi publicado? As pessoas puderam ler sobre esse personagem?
The short story is published, yeah. It's in an anthology.
Ok.
Yeah.
Mas no manifesto você fala também, você conta essa história e você conta também que uma das primeiras versões do seu segundo livro, que é Lara, foi direto para a lata de lixo, e aí literalmente a lata de lixo, porque ele foi datilografado, né? Então eu queria te perguntar, eu fiquei muito curiosa para saber como que você sabe que está na hora de não, aqui vai para o lixo, ou essa história não vai para frente, não está rolando. Tem alguma coisa assim racional? Ou é uma coisa mais no nível da sensação, assim?
Is this a creative writing student
yes.
question?
This is for the writers here.
Yeah. You know, I'm not very good at knowing. I will hammer something into the ground before I accept defeat.
Okay.
Each book is different, so you're right. With my second book, Lara, I spent 3 years working on it as a prose novel, and as you say, I literally threw the manuscript in the bin. It's gone forever. And then I extracted the story and changed it and turned it into a novel in verse, and that took another 2 years. And as soon as I started writing it, I realized it was the right form and the right way to tell this story. But maybe I needed to go through 3 years of it not working for me to come to the point where I found a form, which was a verse novel, where I felt that it could work. Each book is different. I don't really like to show my work to anybody until I'm really confident about it, which means that I don't even get anyone else's feedback on something for maybe years, right? I mean, I never want to go down that road again, by the way. My publisher's sitting here thinking, oh my God, she's going to spend 3 years on the next novel, and then it's going to be another 2 years, and we're never going to see it. But I want to be a faster writer, you know, and I can be a faster writer. So each book is different, and I know most of the writers I know do not go through the process I go through. They do not do that. They start a book, they finish it, and they publish it. That's it, done. And some of them do that in 6 months, or even a month. Even a month, done.
Yes. E você sempre começa a escrever a história pelo começo do livro? Fiquei pensando se você começou daquele ponto, por exemplo, O Garota, Mulher, Outras, ou mesmo O Sr. Loverman. Eles começaram, você começou a escrever onde a gente começa a ler o livro?
Each book is different. So Mr. Loverman started where it starts, but his wife, for anybody who's read the book, his wife has her own sections, Carmel, and they were sewn in after the book was like finished, like maybe the second or third draft. I then put her sections in. And then with Girl, Woman, Other, it started with Carol, who is the 4th character in the book, but she was the character I started with. But I shifted her to a later position for 2 reasons. One is she's raped, and I didn't want to have a novel starting with a rape, because that sets a completely different tone to the tone I wanted to set. So that rape is embedded in the novel as one of the kind of experiences that the women go through. And then also her section, I spent a long time on it, and it was really very poetic. I don't know if anybody notices. It's more poetic than the other sections. And I didn't want to set that up as the style, because it would have taken me 20 years to write the book if I had kept up that very intensely poetic style. It had to be much more free-flowing and open and less intense. So then I wanted to start with Amma, because I knew that Amma in particular would be a character nobody knew, because she's a lesbian, she's about my age, she's a theatre director, she comes from the countercultural community of the 1980s, and the only people who knew people like that were the people who were mixing with them, or they were part of that community. And I knew that people wouldn't know her, and that would be interesting.
Great. Ainda sobre o Garota Mulher Outras, como que você chegou nessa forma, né? Para mim foi muito impressionante pegar o livro e ver como você esse ritmo que você coloca, né? E você mesma deu um nome, não foi você que fusion fiction, né? Ficção de fusão, uma mistura de poesia com prosa. Você tem uma longa jornada, né? Acho que seu primeiro livro é uma coletânea de poemas, depois você publicou livros com versos, livros em verso, né? Ficção em verso, ficção com verso, e aí a gente chegou no Garota Mulher Outras. Mas eu fiquei muito impressionada e fiquei pensando se você, escrevendo, se em algum momento ou em alguns momentos tinha aquela vozinha aqui no ombro falando: isso não vai dar certo, eles nunca vão aceitar, ou se não, se já veio de um jeito que você estava muito confiante sobre isso, porque é muito diferente, né? Isso tem um efeito muito forte sobre a leitura do livro.
So actually, in Mr. Loverman, Carmel's sections are kind of written in that form, or an early version of that form. And I really enjoyed writing her sections where there's very little punctuation and there's this kind of pro-poetic, what I call a pro-poetic patterning on the page. So the sentences just kind of flow. There aren't sentences, it's all one big sentence, and they just kind of flow into each other. And I really enjoyed it. And then when I used that form for Girl, Woman, Other, I really enjoyed it. And it was very liberating, because when you get rid of a full stop, you literally get rid of the stop, and it means that you can just carry on writing. So I kind of realized why a full stop exists, because it gives structure to the language, but it also stops you, right? But without the full stop and just with commas, you could just go on. So the writing, it meant that it was very easy to generate the writing with that form. The problem was, after one or two drafts, it was a complete and utter mess, and it needed more structure. So I had to insert that into the story, because it was all over the place. It was a complete and utter mess, and it wasn't until it was the 5th or 6th draft that it became something that people could read easily and follow. And then people did pick it up and say to me, when I met readers, they would say, oh my God, I saw how it looked, it's experimental, I don't want to read this. But after a few pages, they could get into it. And then they're just flowing in it. And it's almost like that form almost gives it a kind of stream of consciousness feel. Because you're just floating and flowing from one character to the other character to the other character until you get to the end. But here's an interesting story. Somebody in America complained to Amazon that the book hadn't been properly formatted. Amazon, in their wisdom, took it off Amazon because they said, this book is not properly formatted. And it was a week or 2 weeks before my publisher was able to find out and then convince them that actually that's how it was meant to be. And I got emails from people telling me, I just want to tell you that this book has not been proofed, because you haven't got full stops and the text is all over the place. Yeah, so, yeah.
Ah, muito bom. Acho que continuando um pouco nesse raciocínio, no manifesto, você, falando sobre a sua vida, sobre as suas escolhas, né, você fala de liberdade, né, de como você foi você se sentiu livre ou se propôs a ser livre, inclusive para poder escolher a carreira de escritora, né, que não tinha um ganho certo ou muito ganho, pelo menos não naquela época. E eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho sobre essa palavra, o que ela significa para você e para o seu processo criativo, liberdade, porque como que isso te pauta na hora de escrever, né? Assim, se apegar a isso, eu sinto às vezes que você se apega a esse valor mais do que qualquer outra coisa, assim.
It's true. I think as somebody in the arts, you need to be free, right? Freedom, but with discipline. So I've always found that if I try to fit my creativity into any conventional boxes out there, whether it was theatre or literature, that my creativity was just destroyed. And that I needed to find a way to tell the stories I wanted to tell in a way that was unique to me. And that meant ignoring the conventions and exploring and experimenting until I found the freedom to do the thing that I wanted to do. And also to feel entitled to do that. And I know a lot of people don't feel that they have that freedom, that they feel that they have to write in a conventional way. And even, for example, teaching at Brunel University, I used to try really hard to get the students to write experimental fiction, and they were so resistant to it, because in their head that wasn't proper fiction, that wasn't something that they could do. Yet when people did experiment, that's when their work came alive, right? So I've also had a very free life. I've lived a child-free life, not a childless life, but a child-free life. And that was a decision I made, especially coming from a family of 8, growing up in a household of 10 people, way too many people. So that meant that I had the freedom to not earn enough money, to not have to settle down and get a job and buy my own property, which is what people of my generation did, less so now because people can't afford it so much. You know, I was able to lead a peripatetic lifestyle, which fed my creativity and allowed me to do what I wanted to do. So I've had a very, I would say, relatively free life compared to a lot of people that I knew who chose a very conventional life.
E por que você escreve? Espera aí, que tá na hora das perguntas? 10 minutos. Vou fazer essa pergunta, então, e a gente abre para as pessoas? Tá bom. Queria te perguntar por que você escreve. E se a resposta para essa pergunta, se ela mudou ao longo da sua carreira, se a Bernardine, lá de 1994, publicando o primeiro livro, responderia da mesma forma que a Bernardine de hoje, que ganhou o Booker, que escreve há um tempão, que tem uma carreira como escritora.
It's very interesting because you're talking about 30 years ago, and I wrote because that gave me the greatest pleasure, the greatest creative pleasure, as it did, 40 years ago. Now I write because I feel it's in my DNA, because having spent all my adult life writing, it's as integral to who I am as breathing. It is it's my creative expression, but it's also how I exist in the world. And I wouldn't have said that in my 20s or 30s because I hadn't spent a lifetime doing it. But when you've been doing it for a lifetime, it's just who I am as a writer at a very deep cellular level. It's how I think, it's how I process everything I experience, it's how I process my feelings about the politics that's happening in the world. Not that it's necessarily going directly into my writing, but it is there and it is feeding my creativity.
That's great. Então, acho que agora as perguntas. Alguém tem perguntas? Gilvan.
Hello. Thanks for your generosity of sharing such a great story. Thanks, Isabela, too. You don't listen?
Sorry. Oh, you're asking in English?
I am asking in English. Sorry.
I was listening to the...
Vou perguntar em português. Então, eu estava agradecendo pela generosidade em compartilhar sua história e, obviamente, adorando as perguntas, a condução da Isabela. Mas tem uma coincidência incrível, porque eu publiquei um livro sobre 2 personagens LGBTI+, um mês depois de ler o Mr. Loverman, que foi um presente da Alessandra, aqui da Bíblia, que me indicou o livro, né? E eu achei incrível, porque muitas dos diálogos e das histórias, claro que com outras palavras, eu não imaginava que existia o Mr. Loverman até ter sido publicado no Brasil. Então, eu acho que a representação de personagens mais velhos, LGBTI+, na literatura, é ainda pequena. Então, de certa maneira, eu espero estar fazendo uma contribuição para isso. Mas como é que você vê a questão o que é que isso pode gerar na sociedade, falando de mudança social, em termos de entendimento e de empatia? Porque a minha história trata de 2 homopáteres, são 2 personagens casados em casamentos heterossexuais, presos, com filhos, e eles vão viver o dilema se eles vão ficar juntos ou não. O livro trata de uma tribo específica, a tribo dos bears, ou dos ursos. Nós que éramos ursos e não sabíamos. Então, eu queria que você explorasse um pouco essa questão dos personagens e essa questão social, do entendimento, porque é uma questão muito presente dessa geração que nasceu entre 65 e 80, a tal da geração X, que existem muitos homens ainda, e mulheres também, enrustidos, e eu percebo que agora eu tenho uma demanda para traduzir o livro para o árabe, por exemplo. Eu criei um perfil no Instagram que tem milhares de seguidores, e eles me perguntam tradução para várias línguas, incluindo o árabe, onde a homossexualidade é crime, como o Irã, por exemplo. Então, eu queria que você...
I think we know that fiction is a great empathy driver, that people, through interacting with, fictionalized characters, if it's done well, it bridges the divide between them and those characters, and they get to see and understand people who are not like them, and it's great for society and social change. I think LGBTQ+ fiction does exactly that. You know what I mean? People who don't know queer people in their lives, don't come across them, who have assumptions about what that kind of existence is like. When they read, say, your novel or my novel, their eyes are opened, and that's a great thing for society.
Muito grato. A sua voz me faz sentir bem próximo. Eu não conheço nada de inglês. Eu senti a sua voz, a sua língua no meu corpo. Mas a questão que eu pergunto, a partir de uma experiência que eu tive essa semana, uma cadeirante e seu companheiro no ônibus, eles estavam falando que ia trabalhar. E o trabalho é pegar uma balinha e vender no farol. Só que estava chovendo, daí eles decidiram que não ia trabalhar na chuva. O que essa analogia eu estou querendo colocar? Me parece que estão criando-se um mundo livre que não estão nem aí para o status quo e nem para essa administração da polis. A literatura não está criando também um mundo que está deixando de lado a polis dessa administração horrível para a humanidade e está trazendo uma nova vida a qual tem a possibilidade de desmontar por si só essa forma de estrutura do Estado.
That's a statement. Great, that's a statement. Thank you. Do any women have any questions?
Primeiramente, queria agradecer por Garota, Mulher, Outras. Eu me identifiquei muito também. Obrigada por esse fim, para a Penélope e para a Hattie. Foi incrível, estava num ano difícil, e ver esse final foi um respiro, foi uma coisa muito positiva. Então, muito obrigada por ele. E eu sei que você escreve ficção, mas queria saber se tem alguma personagem que está mais próxima de você, embora você as viva quando está escrevendo, ou se todas você se afasta mesmo para conseguir falar sobre, ou se tudo ali tem um pouquinho também de Bernardine.
I would say that I'm not in them, you know, but at the same time, I'm God. I created them, right? And they do only what I ask them to do. But at the same time, they are not me, apart from when I say, like Amma in the first character, you know, slightly autobiographical. But once they're written, that's it, really. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I'm quite ruthless. Once they're written, they're out there in the world, and I only really reconnect with them when I read at public readings. I don't reread my novels if I can avoid it. I find that very difficult to do. So, yeah, so they're just out there as these characters existing in this fictional world that I've created, doing their thing. And I'm kind of like divorced from them. With some books, I do get emotional at the end. So my book, The Emperor's Babe, is about a black girl growing up in Roman London 2,000 years ago. And at the end of the book, she dies. And I really loved writing that book, and I loved her as a character. And I did feel quite traumatized at the fact that she died. But of course, I was her murderer at the same time. I'm very ruthless. It was very good for the story that she would, you know, she would no longer be there. Yeah.
Acho que temos tempo para uma última pergunta. Alguém? Bom, primeiro, obrigada pelas suas palavras, foram muito inspiradoras, e também a Isabela, que, enfim, fez aí questões exaustivas e ótimas. Eu queria perguntar um pouco sobre o manifesto. Eu li recentemente, e o que eu senti é um livro de não ficção, né, um livro que conta da sua vida, mas ele tem um aspecto de muita sinceridade, né? A gente espera, às vezes, quando uma pessoa faz uma autobiografia, muitas vezes ela disfarça um pouco os lados dela que talvez ela não admire tanto. E, no entanto, no manifesto, o que eu sinto é que você não tentou fazer isso, né? A gente vê claramente a Bernardine ali, em momentos bons e em momentos não tão bons, né? Eu fiquei muito impressionada com o relato que você faz logo no começo, logo na primeira parte, ou na segunda, sobre como você terminou com um namorado, levando suas amantes no seu quarto, ao lado do quarto dele, e depois teve um final trágico, né, a separação. E eu fico imaginando que não deve ser fácil se expor assim e colocar esse tipo de passagem. Então, como é para você colocar isso num livro e saber, ainda mais agora, que você é mundialmente conhecida, né, que tantas pessoas vão ler sobre suas intimidades de forma tão honesta?
You know, I reckon that book is not everything. Do you know what I mean? It's like maybe 80% or 70%. So there are, and don't forget, I come from a large family, so it's like, you know, there are things that I may write about years hence that I did not write about in this book. But writing about the sort of, those kind of moments where I behave badly, for example, I loved it. I loved writing that, because I know that's so interesting to people. You know, when they get to see who you really are or were, and you're telling them. Because I know that when I read autobiographies, I totally agree with you. I've read literary autobiographies, especially literary autobiographies, not film stars or musicians, because they will tell you, and I was taking drugs for 10 years and the rest of it. You know, they love all that stuff. But literary autobiographies, they're kind of protecting their reputation. And you end reading the book and you don't know it, you don't know them, because they just haven't revealed themselves to you. So I really wanted to reveal myself, you know, 70 or 80%, to the reader, so that they would know who I was. And all those things, like the thing that you mentioned, that's the juicy stuff, where you're telling people, look, I've lived, I've been there, I've done it, I've thrown up, I went to bed with somebody and I was sick on them, you know. When I was very young, you know, all of that. And I also knew that people weren't expecting that as well. They probably would expect me to talk about, you know, my relationship to literature and, you know, and the arts and visual art. And it's true, I have all of that. But this is not what this book was going to be. And so when there is a degree of honesty, you know you're connecting to people, and they're thinking, oh, well, I've been there, I felt that, I've done that. You know, and it becomes more meaningful for everybody.
Bom, gente, acho que está na hora de encerrar. Vou fazer coro. Don't go, stay in Brazil. You're already Brazilian. Quero agradecer de novo todo mundo. Acho que foi muito gostoso. Agradecer a Bernardine por ser sempre tão inspiradora, tão honesta, tão franca. Obrigada, gente.
And thank you, Isabela. Thank you.